Detective Mark Henderson raced against time. Judge Caroline Ellis made a fatal oversight, and 68 innocent lives were shattered in a single night. A mistake that shocked the nation and broke the detectives tasked with uncovering the truth. The night started like any other at the popular downtown nightclub in Brooksville. The music was loud, the lights flashing in a rhythmic pattern, and the crowd was alive with excitement. Patrons laughed, danced, and celebrated, unaware that what began as a night of entertainment would quickly turn into chaos. Detective Mark Henderson, called to the scene within minutes, knew that his experience had never prepared him for the scale of what he was about to confront. Emergency responders were already frantically moving through the club, trying to reach victims while dodging debris and overturned furniture. The smell of smoke, faint but lingering, mingled with the heavy scent of spilled drinks and panic. The first responders discovered the injured scattered across the dance floor, near the bar, and along the walls. Some had minor scrapes and bruises, while others were critically hurt, with broken bones, head trauma, and deep lacerations. Every person's injuries told a story of chaos and terror. Among the 68 injured, many were unable to speak or remember how the disaster had occurred, leaving witnesses and authorities struggling to piece together the sequence of events. As paramedics moved swiftly from victim to victim, Detective Henderson observed the scene with a growing sense of dread. Something about the pattern of injuries didn't add up. The placement of the victims, the angles of impact, and the way certain areas of the club had collapsed suggested that this was not a simple accident. As investigators began to cordon off sections of the nightclub, security footage became a crucial element. To their frustration, key portions of the video were missing, leaving only fragmented clips of people running, chairs toppling, and panic spreading. Staff members, when questioned, gave conflicting accounts. Some claimed the crowd had surged unexpectedly, while others insisted that a structural failure had caused the chaos. Henderson noticed subtle discrepancies. The timing of injuries didn't match the accounts, and certain areas of the club seemed almost deliberately avoided in the footage. The more he examined the evidence, the more it became clear that there was more to this incident than a simple accident. News of the disaster spread quickly, capturing national attention. The media reported on the 68 injured, broadcasting images of emergency vehicles and the chaotic scene to millions of viewers. Public outrage grew as details emerged, and questions arose about how a nightclub could allow such a tragedy to occur. Inspectors revealed that the building had failed safety checks on multiple occasions, but a recent court ruling had allowed the club to remain open. Documents later obtained by the investigators suggested that Judge Caroline Ellis had overruled appeals and ignored prior violations, prioritizing procedural technicalities over the safety of patrons. Detective Henderson understood that this case was larger than the physical injuries. It was a story of negligence, oversight, and systemic failure. Every photograph, medical report, and witness statement added weight to the idea that the disaster had been preventable. As the first night of investigation ended, Henderson and his team were left staring at the enormous scope of what they had uncovered. The 68 injured were only the beginning of the story. Behind the chaos lay a chain of decisions, errors, and oversight that had set the stage for one of the most shocking events the nation had ever seen. The detectives would need every ounce of skill, patience, and determination to untangle the web of negligence and uncover the truth, and the first hours of investigation made it painfully clear that nothing about this case would be ordinary. The following morning, the magnitude of the catastrophe became even more apparent. Hospitals in Brooksville were overwhelmed with patients suffering from a wide range of injuries. Some were minor, a few bruises or sprained ankles, but many were life-altering, including broken bones, head trauma, and internal injuries. Every medical report seemed to tell a story of chaos and preventable harm. Detective Mark Henderson and his team spent hours reviewing patient records, trying to connect the dots between the injuries and the events that had taken place inside the nightclub. Each new detail raised more questions than answers. How could a single night out result in such a wide spectrum of trauma? Why had safety measures failed so completely? And most importantly, who was responsible? As investigators examined the scene further, a troubling pattern emerged. Many injuries had occurred in areas that were supposed to be secure. Exits meant for emergencies had been blocked or locked, safety barriers had been removed, and overcrowding had been allowed unchecked. Inspectors' notes revealed repeated warnings over the past year, documenting structural hazards and violations of fire codes. Yet despite these warnings, the nightclub remained open, and patrons were left exposed to extreme risk. The detective team began to understand that human error or negligence was at the heart of the disaster. Every broken railing, every blocked exit, every ignored warning sign was a piece of a puzzle that led straight to the chain of command responsible for public safety. Their investigation soon led to Judge Caroline Ellis, the presiding officer who had made the controversial ruling allowing the nightclub to operate despite failing multiple inspections. Court documents revealed that she had overruled appeals by city inspectors, dismissing concerns over structural integrity and fire code violations. It appeared her decision had prioritized legal technicalities and procedural formalities over the lives of hundreds of citizens. Detective Henderson and his team realized that this single judicial ruling had created the conditions for catastrophe. The weight of this revelation was overwhelming. Not only were the injured victims suffering, but the system designed to protect them had failed in a fundamental way. The pressure on the detectives intensified as the public demanded accountability. Families of the injured flocked to police stations, journalists flooded briefings with questions, and social media erupted with outrage. Every detail of the nightclub's operation and Judge Ellis's ruling was dissected and debated in the public eye. Henderson's team meticulously reviewed the documentation, cross-referencing inspection reports, emails, and staff logs. They discovered discrepancies suggesting that the nightclub management had deliberately ignored certain safety warnings, emboldened by the court ruling that effectively guaranteed them immunity from immediate closure. The complexity of the case weighed heavily on the detectives. Each injury represented not only physical trauma but also emotional devastation, and Henderson could feel the enormity of the responsibility pressing down on him. The team began reconstructing the sequence of events leading up to the disaster, examining security footage, witness statements, and staff records. Every element pointed to a perfect storm of negligence and oversight, a disaster that had been allowed to happen by both the legal system and those entrusted with enforcing safety regulations. As the day drew to a close, Henderson understood that this investigation was no ordinary case. The 68 injuries were just the visible tip of a much larger problem, a systemic failure that extended from the nightclub to the courtroom. The detectives faced an uphill battle to uncover the truth, hold the responsible parties accountable, and deliver justice for the victims. It was a race against time, and every hour that passed brought them closer to the full, shocking scale of the disaster that had shaken the nation. The investigation intensified as Detective Mark Henderson and his team began piecing together exactly how the 68 injuries had occurred inside the nightclub. Using a combination of fragmented security footage, eyewitness accounts, and staff records, they began to reconstruct the chaotic night in painstaking detail. What had initially appeared to be random and unavoidable now revealed a horrifying level of preventable mismanagement. Certain areas of the club were clearly dangerous, with structural weaknesses and improperly secured furniture. Emergency exits had been blocked by crates and equipment, creating bottlenecks that trapped patrons in the most hazardous zones. The pattern of injuries was becoming increasingly clear. Some were accidental, but many were directly caused by negligence that could have, and should have, been addressed long before that night. As Henderson studied the evidence, he realized that the nightclub's management had been operating with reckless disregard for safety. Internal emails and staff communications revealed that warnings from previous inspections had been ignored. Employees had been instructed to focus on revenue and crowd control rather than ensuring patrons' well-being. Certain staff members were caught on footage manipulating barriers and allowing overcrowding in restricted areas. Every new discovery added layers of complexity to the case, revealing a web of deliberate oversight and risky decision-making. It became apparent that the injuries were not purely accidental. They were the result of a chain reaction set in motion by human error, negligence, and institutional failure. The detectives turned their attention to Judge Caroline Ellis, whose recent ruling had effectively allowed the nightclub to continue operating despite repeated violations. Court records, transcripts, and correspondence revealed that Ellis had dismissed warnings from city inspectors and overruled appeals by community members concerned for public safety. Her decisions had unintentionally given the nightclub management the confidence to ignore regulations, placing thousands of patrons in danger. Henderson realized that the disaster had not just been a series of unfortunate events. It had been enabled at the highest levels of authority. A single judicial ruling had created the conditions for 68 people to be injured in one night. As they analyzed the footage further, the detectives uncovered evidence of additional misconduct. Some of the most severe injuries had occurred in areas that were supposed to be reinforced or monitored, but which had been tampered with. Railings were loose, furniture had been stacked precariously, and exit routes were deliberately narrowed. The team discovered that staff had been instructed to redirect patrons toward the most crowded areas to maximize sales and control. This meant that people were forced into dangerous conditions, where a simple stumble could result in broken bones, lacerations, or worse. Each injury documented in medical reports matched a location in the club where negligence had directly contributed to harm, leaving Henderson shaken by the extent of the preventable disaster. Public outrage began to mount as details of the investigation leaked. Families of the injured and uninjured spectators demanded answers, while journalists scrutinized Judge Ellis's rulings and the nightclub's history of violations. Henderson's team worked long hours, cross-referencing witness statements, medical reports, and staff records to ensure that every connection was documented. The detectives understood that this case was about more than just the injuries themselves. It was about accountability, justice, and exposing the systemic failures that allowed such a tragedy to unfold. With every new piece of evidence, the scope of the disaster became clearer, and the detectives were forced to confront the unsettling truth. The chaos of that night had been preventable, and the responsibility rested not just with one person, but with a series of decisions that had compounded into catastrophe. The pressure on Detective Mark Henderson and his team intensified as the investigation unfolded further. Every day brought new revelations, each more disturbing than the last. They had now established that the 68 injuries were not simply the result of an accident or unforeseen chaos. They were the outcome of a perfect storm of negligence, oversight, and deliberate disregard for safety protocols. The nightclub management had ignored repeated warnings from inspectors, altered the layout of the club to maximize crowd density, and failed to enforce basic safety measures. Every detail they uncovered reinforced the idea that this disaster had been preventable, leaving Henderson and his colleagues frustrated and disillusioned. Judge Caroline Ellis, whose ruling had allowed the nightclub to remain open despite repeated violations, became a central focus of public outrage. The detectives examined court transcripts, emails, and internal memos that revealed her awareness of potential dangers. Her decision, whether influenced by bureaucratic pressure, procedural technicalities, or misplaced priorities, had effectively cleared the path for the disaster to occur. It became evident that her judgment had played a critical role in enabling the conditions that led to the injuries. Henderson felt the weight of responsibility, not only to the victims but to the public who had placed their trust in the justice system. The sense of betrayal was heavy. Those meant to protect citizens had inadvertently contributed to their suffering. Further analysis of the club itself uncovered even more alarming details. Structural weaknesses had gone unaddressed for months. Emergency exits were partially blocked, and fire suppression systems had not been maintained properly. Staff training had been inadequate, and instructions to prioritize profit over safety were embedded in everyday procedures. Henderson realized that the management had operated under a calculated risk, relying on Judge Ellis's ruling as a shield against enforcement action. The more he uncovered, the more he understood that the 68 injuries were not random. They were the inevitable result of a system that had failed at every level. The emotional toll on the detectives was immense. They had witnessed the aftermath firsthand. Hospital rooms filled with injured patrons, families in despair, and citizens questioning whether their own safety could ever be guaranteed. Each new piece of evidence felt like another personal failure, as though the detectives themselves were carrying the burden of a system that had allowed preventable suffering. Long hours and intense scrutiny from the media only added to the stress. Henderson and his team were determined to maintain focus, knowing that uncovering the truth was the only way to deliver justice and prevent future disasters. The case also exposed deeper issues within the city's regulatory and judicial systems. Inspectors had documented violations repeatedly, only to be overruled or ignored. Communications between the nightclub, the courts, and city officials had been fragmented, and in some cases deliberately obstructed. Henderson realized that the disaster had been a systemic failure, a combination of human error, flawed judgment, and procedural loopholes. It was a stark reminder that accountability was not just an individual responsibility but a collective one. By the time the investigation was ready to move forward, the detectives had amassed overwhelming evidence of negligence and systemic failure. The 68 injuries were no longer just numbers, they were a reflection of human suffering caused by errors at every level. Henderson knew that the case would leave a lasting mark on the city, the victims, and the investigators themselves. It was a reminder that a single mistake, especially when compounded by others, could ripple through countless lives, leaving devastation in its wake. Every piece of evidence collected, every testimony recorded, and every photograph analyzed would contribute to a story of tragedy, accountability, and the heavy burden of justice in the aftermath of preventable disaster. The final phase of the investigation brought the full scope of the Brooksville nightclub disaster into sharp relief. Detective Mark Henderson and his team had spent weeks meticulously analyzing every piece of evidence, from security footage to inspection reports, medical records, and court documents. It was now painfully clear that the 68 injuries were the result of a cascade of failures, each one avoidable if proper procedures had been followed. The nightclub management, emboldened by Judge Caroline Ellis's ruling, had prioritized profit and reputation over safety, while oversight authorities had allowed procedural loopholes to persist unchallenged. The combination of human error, legal misjudgment, and willful negligence had created the perfect storm that left dozens injured and families shattered. The courtroom proceedings were intense, drawing national attention as prosecutors detailed the chain of events that led to the injuries. Henderson and his team provided critical testimony, presenting evidence of blocked exits, faulty railings, and ignored safety warnings. They traced each injury back to specific decisions, demonstrating how neglect and poor judgment compounded into widespread harm. The prosecution argued that Judge Ellis's ruling had directly contributed to the catastrophe by allowing the nightclub to continue operating despite repeated violations. The defense attempted to downplay the severity, claiming the injuries were unforeseeable and largely accidental, but the evidence was overwhelming. Each medical report, photograph, and security clip reinforced the undeniable fact that these injuries could have been prevented. The victims' families sat through the trial, their grief palpable in the courtroom. Many had spent weeks in hospitals navigating surgeries, rehabilitation, and emotional trauma. Their testimony highlighted the devastating human cost of systemic failure. Children, young adults, and older patrons, all injured in one preventable disaster, became the living proof of negligence at multiple levels. The public watched closely as the case unfolded, grappling with the uncomfortable reality that a judicial ruling, meant to enforce fairness, had unintentionally set the stage for chaos and suffering. As the trial concluded, Judge Ellis faced severe criticism for her role in the disaster. Investigators uncovered patterns in her rulings that suggested a repeated willingness to prioritize procedural technicalities over public safety. While she had not acted maliciously, her decisions had inadvertently placed countless individuals at risk, and the consequences were undeniable. The nightclub management faced multiple criminal charges for negligence, obstruction, and endangering the public, while civil suits sought restitution for the injured. Henderson understood that justice, while imperfect, was now moving toward accountability. In the aftermath, Brooksville slowly began to heal, though the scars of that night remained. The nightclub was permanently closed, safety regulations were strengthened, and the incident became a cautionary tale for municipalities nationwide. Detective Henderson reflected on the case with a mixture of pride and sorrow. The investigation had uncovered the truth and brought accountability, but it had also left an indelible mark on the city, the victims, and the detectives themselves. The story of the 68 injuries stood as a grim reminder of how fragile public trust can be, and how a single judicial mistake, compounded by negligence, can ripple through countless lives with devastating consequences. The nation remained shocked, the judicial system humbled, and the detectives forever marked by the case that revealed the heavy cost of errors left unchecked.